Thank you, Jamel, and thank you to our worship team. Thank you guys for leading us in worship, and thank you for the time that you put in each week to prepare for leading us. Thank you for using your gifts that way. Like I said to the children this morning, we're preaching on a sort of a hidden gem of a Bible story. In the book of 1 Kings and 2 Kings, it is, as the title would suggest, sort of taking you through the kings and the rulers of Israel. You remember Israel's story. Abraham promised that from him a great nation would come, and they multiplied, and Abraham had a lot of descendants. They were enslaved in Egypt, and God set them free. They came to the promised land. They were ruled by judges, and then they were ruled by a series of kings. But what we sometimes forget is that the kingdom of Israel split at a particular point. Solomon's son did such a bad job ruling the kingdom that it split into two. So you have a northern kingdom of Israel and a southern kingdom of Judah. The story that we're reading today comes at a time when the kingdom had been split. And God sent a series of prophets to the northern kingdom, some of whom wrote books and some of whom were more action prophets. And Elisha is the prophet that we're going to be talking about today. Elijah and Elisha get confused a lot. Their names obviously are very similar. Just remember that it's alphabetical. Elijah came first, and God sent him to really wake Israel up and say, how long, as Elijah asked to the people, how long are you going to waver between two opinions? How long are you going to worship Yahweh and also worship these other gods on the side? Elijah famously was taken up to be with God in a chariot of fire, but before he left, he found an apprentice, or God led him to an apprentice. And Elisha just had a small favor to ask Elijah. Elisha said, before you go, I need you to give me a double portion of whatever you've got. So, just think about Elijah as sort of the prototypical prophet. And Elijah says, yes, I'd like twice that, if you don't mind. God's still got work to do here. So that's the sort of person Elisha was, sort of a bold person, and a person who is operating now as a prophet of God. But the story doesn't start there. It starts in the country to the north of Israel. It starts in a country called Aram, which today is a country we call Syria. So let's look at 2 Kings chapter 5. What we're going to do is we're going to go a couple of verses in, then we'll stop and talk about that in a little detail, and then we'll go a couple more verses. 2 Kings chapter 5, going through verses 1 through 8. Now Naaman, captain of the army of the king of Aram, was a great man with his master, and highly respected, because by him the Lord had given victory to Aram. The man was also a valiant warrior, but he was a leper. Now the Arameans had gone out in bands and had taken captive a little girl from the lands of Israel. And she waited on Naaman's wife. And she said to her mistress, I wish that my master were with the prophet who is in Samaria. Then he would cure him of his leprosy. And Naaman went in and told his master, the king, saying, thus and thus spoke the girl who is from the land of Israel. Then the king of Aram said, go now, and I will send a letter to the king of Israel. And Naaman left, and departed, and took with him 10 talents of silver, that's a lot of money, and 6,000 shekels of gold, that's also a lot of money, and 10 changes of clothes. And he brought the letter to the king of Israel, saying, now as this letter comes to you, behold, I have sent Naaman my servant to you, that you may cure him of his leprosy. And it came about, when the king of Israel read the letter, that he tore his clothes and said, am I God to kill and make alive, that this man is sending word to me to cure a man of his leprosy? But consider now and see how he is seeking a quarrel against me. And it happened, when Elisha, the man of God, heard the king of Israel had torn his clothes, that he sent word to the king, saying, why have you torn your clothes? Now let him come to me, and he shall know that there is a prophet in Israel. So this is where this story begins. Aram, modern-day Syria. And at this time, Aram was a powerful, not exactly an empire, but a powerful kingdom. As you can see, they are more or less at war with Israel. If you are sending raiding bands into your neighboring country, it's not a peaceful situation. And as we read, they are winning. Everywhere they went out, Naaman is at the head of the army. He's a valiant warrior. And it says that God has given him victory. But he also is a leper. He has what today is called Hansen's disease, and you can see how being an army general and a leper might be a bit of a problem. Be a problem to be a leper in general. Your life expectancy goes down considerably, and the quality of your life. But to be a person whose job it is to fight and to swing swords at people and to have leprosy, His life expectancy was already low. As a captain of the army, it's going even lower. And a very unlikely person offers him what in the ancient world they would have called salvation, healing. It doesn't ever use the word slave, but this little girl captured from Israel is a slave. That's the way slavery worked in the ancient world. It wasn't based on race, it was based on who won the war. And so the Arameans have raided into Israel and taken captives, and those captives become slaves. And this little girl is a slave in Naaman's house, and yet she has compassion on him and says, I wish you could go see Elisha. She's from Israel, and she's heard about Elisha and what Elisha can do, and she just knows that Elisha can cure leprosy. You can see why, by the way, as a little aside, when Jesus was working in Galilee and he was doing the sort of things he did, that people called him a prophet. Because this is the sort of thing that prophets did, was heal people, and particularly heal lepers. Leprosy also is highly contagious, and so lepers tended to be avoided by other people. And so although Naaman is a leper, he continues to serve in the army and continues to inhabit his house. And so it shows you with what high esteem the people around him had, that they were willing to risk themselves to keep him in that position of authority. But this little girl who has no authority at all suggests to him a way of salvation. And so Naaman goes to his king. You can't just go into Israel and find a prophet. They're enemies. And so Naaman goes to the king and says, I have heard about somebody who could cure me. And the king of Aram, I love this, the king of Aram just assumes that if there's a prophet, a man of God, working in Israel, then the prophet and the king must be like this. Because that's the way all other ancient societies worked. In a lot of places, the priest was the king. In a lot of places, the high priest and the king were the same person. That's the way it was in Egypt. The pharaohs were called sons of God. He was not only the head of the country, he was the head of the religion too. And so the king of Aram, this must be the way it is in Aram, the priests and the prophets and the soothsayers and the king, I mean, they all work together, right? So he sends Naaman to the king of Israel and says, tell your prophet to heal my guy. But the king of Israel gets this letter, I need you to cure my guy of leprosy. And the king of Israel gets really upset and says, this is the weirdest pretext for an international incident that I have ever heard. If you go look around the world, there are dozens of places where two different countries claim the same territory. And so that's a pretext for an international incident. If one army goes into or one place occupies this place that's claimed, then they can say, you've broken the rules and we're going to war with each other. There's all sorts of reasons that countries make up to go to war with each other, but this would be the weirdest one. And that's the only thing that the king of Israel can assume is, you sent your general for me to cure him of leprosy? And he didn't mention Elisha. It just said, I want you, the king of Aram said, I want you to cure this man of leprosy. And so the king of Israel, his mind is blown by this. Word gets out that this has happened, and Elisha hears about it. And so Elisha says, he meant to send him to me. It didn't mean you to cure him of leprosy. He wasn't talking to you. He was talking to me, the man of God. It's a little bit different in Israel. You can look through any of the prophets, and they don't just assume that the prophet and the king are on the same side. The prophet is on God's side. It's kind of up in the air as to what the king decides to do, and most of the Israelite kings decided not to be on the side of God, which was why the prophets were there in the first place, to remind the people, don't just do what the king says. You have a higher authority even over the king, which is God. So Elisha steps in and says, would you please just send him to me? He was supposed to be coming to me anyway. So then the story picks up in 2 Kings 5, verse 9. We'll go through verse 16. So Naaman came with his horses and his chariots and stood at the doorway of the house of Elisha. And Elisha sent a messenger to him saying, go and wash in the Jordan River 7 times, and your flesh shall be restored to you, and you shall be clean. But Naaman was furious and went away and said, behold, I thought he will surely come out to me and stand and call on the name of the Lord his God and wave his hand over the place and cure the leper. Are not Abana and Pharpar, the rivers of Damascus, better than all the waters of Israel? Could I not wash in them and be clean? So he turned and went away in a rage. His servants came near and spoke to him and said, my father, had the prophet told you to do some great thing, would you not have done it? How much more then when he says to you, wash and be clean? So he went down and dipped himself 7 times in the Jordan, according to the word of the man of God. And his flesh was restored, like the flesh of a little child, and he was clean. When he returned to the man of God with all his company and came and stood before him, he said, "Behold, now I know that there is no God in all the earth but in Israel. So please take a present from your servant now." But Elisha said, "As the Lord lives, before whom I stand, I will take nothing." And he urged him to take it, but he refused. The prophet is independent. Independent not only of the king of Israel, but also independent of Naaman's expectations. Naaman has some expectations of what healing by a prophet is going to look like. First of all, he's actually going to see the prophet. The prophet is going to actually come out of his house to talk to him. A general of a nation that is at war with Israel, and a general of a nation that has been winning the war with Israel, shows up at his door asking for healing, and Elisha doesn't even come outside. We don't even know what Elisha was doing. Let's assume he was working on his sermon. The story goes, and I haven't been able to confirm this, but the story goes that Billy Graham, the great evangelistic preacher, that Billy Graham would spend an hour each day in prayer in the morning. And Billy Graham was a person that a lot of presidents reached out to for input. And the story goes that one time some president of the United States called during that time, and Billy Graham's secretary said, "I'm sorry, he can't talk to you right now, he's busy." The president, because he's talking to God. I mean, there's a ranking here. And so assuming that Elisha is doing something more important with someone more important than Naaman, who showed up at his door. The prophet is independent of kings, the king of Aram, the king of Israel, and Naaman's expectations. And like I said to the children, this work of salvation is almost, just about, nearly undone by pride. He wouldn't even come outside and talk to me. He didn't call on the name of the Lord his God. There was no show. And he told me to go wash in this dinky little river that's here in Israel. There are great rivers in Damascus. Could have washed there. Naaman expected to be greeted according to his station. The opening verses talk about how great this guy is. And apparently Naaman made the mistake that a lot of great people do, which is someone told him they were great and they believed them. And so Naaman believes he is great. And so he expects, something great to happen. And he expects to be greeted according to his station. Instead, he gets a servant at the door. The servant comes out and says, "You need to go wash in the river 7 times. Let us know how it goes." He also expects a task in keeping with his station. A quest, a challenge. Go and seek whatever, and then you'll be healed. My favorite quest recently of recent movies comes from the modern classic Nacho Libre. This is not going to be the only time that I'm going to reference Nacho Libre in a sermon, so you just need to prepare yourselves. But the monk, Nacho, is trying to become a great wrestler, and so he is given the quest to climb a mountain up to the eagle's nest and break open the eagle's egg and drink the yolk of the eagle's egg. So if Elisha had come out and told Naaman, "You must climb the mountain and break open the eagle's egg and drink the yolk of the eagle's egg," Naaman would have said, "Yes, I'll do that." He was looking for something epic, something amazing to do, a quest, a challenge, something that he could add to his list of accomplishments. I did this, and so I got healed. But a servant says, "Go wash in the river." And he storms off. Came all this way for nothing. And then his servants intervene and talk sense into him and say, "If he'd asked you to do something great, you would have done it. He asked you to do something simple, so why don't you do that?" And so he goes and he does it. His first and last step, he needed a quest, but his quest was exactly one step. His first and last step was this. Quest task number 1, and the ending quest task is, be humble enough and obedient enough to do what God tells you to do. That's the first and last step of his quest for healing. Be humble enough and obedient enough to do what God tells you to do. So he does it. Then comes one of my favorite parts of this story. Look at 2 Kings 5:16 through 18. And we'll stop there. There's a question, and we'll get to the answer to the question in verse 19. So don't look ahead if you've got your Bible open. Verse 16. Let's go back to verse 15. He meets Elisha finally. He returned to the man of God with all his company and came and stood before him. And he said, "Behold, now I know there is no God in all the earth but in Israel. So please take a present from your servant now." And he said, "As the Lord lives, before whom I stand," this is Elisha talking, "I will take nothing." And he urged him to take it, but Elisha refused. And Naaman said, "If not, please let your servant at least be given 2 mules' load of earth. For your servant will no more offer burnt offering nor will he sacrifice to other gods, but to the Lord. In this matter, may the Lord pardon your servant. When my master goes, when the king goes into the house of Rimmon to worship there, and he leans on my hand, and I bow myself in the house of Rimmon. When I bow myself in the house of Rimmon, the Lord, Yahweh, God of Israel, pardon your servant in that matter. Pause there for a second. So there's two great things about this. Elisha just refuses flat out to take any payment for what has happened. I'm not looking for presents. He asks him twice, and he says no. Then, when Elisha won't take a present, he asks Elisha for something. Can I take two mules load of dirt from this place and take it back to Syria? And you might think, what a weird thing to ask for. Do any of you have any dirt that you have taken from somewhere? Just asking. Yeah. Where do you take dirt from? Not Home Depot. No, that's not the kind of dirt I'm talking about. Not Home Depot dirt where you're going to build a garden, but a place you've gone and you brought back dirt. What kind of dirt? Where do you bring back dirt from?
Painted desert.
What?
Painted desert.
The painted desert. Yeah, somewhere cool. Somewhere that shows I've been there. Somewhere that has some kind of meaning to you. And so Naaman wants to take not a little, tin can full of dirt or not a little vial full of dirt. He wants 2 mules load of dirt. That's enough dirt to make, a space about like this. What Naaman wants to do is take a little spot of Israel home so that he can have a little Israel at his house. That's where he's going to worship from now on. He's done with all the other gods. He's going to worship Yahweh, and he wants to worship Yahweh on Israelite soil. So he has to take it with him to Syria. That's amazing. He has totally changed by what has happened to him. Then he asks for something. He asks 2 things. Can I take this dirt? And we assume that he said, sure. Take all the dirt you want. We've got plenty of dirt. Then he says this. Because of my job as general of the army of the Arameans, sometimes I go with the king to worship in the house of Rimmon, who's the god of Aram. And it's part of my job. I have to go with him. The king leans on my arm. It's a big thing. And the king has to bow before the idol, the statue of Rimmon. And because he's holding on to my arm, I have to bow too. Can you please excuse, I'm not going to worship Rimmon anymore, but I have to go as part of my job to do that. I was teaching this to a group of youth one time, and I asked them, what do you think Elisha said to this? Elisha, who has refused payment for his services. Elisha, who is the inheritor of Elijah, who called out, challenged the prophets of Baal on Mount Carmel and rained down fire on the altar. What's Elisha going to say when he says, I have to, because of my job, go to this place, and it's going to look like I'm worshiping this thing, but I'm not. Is that okay with you? And then Elisha says in 2 Kings 5:19, he said to him, go in peace. So he departed from some distance. He departed from him some distance. It's just kind of a shocking moment of grace in the Old Testament that Naaman has already said, I'm not worshiping anybody else except the God who healed me. So much so, in fact, I want to take dirt home with me. But because of my job, I have to do this thing, is that, can I get a pass from the way it looks according to this? And Elisha says, go in peace. And it just is this amazing moment of grace. Jesus says in John chapter 10, a group of Greeks come up to him at the Passover, and they're looking for him. They're looking for the Messiah. We actually don't find out what happens when he meets the Greeks because the disciples are so shocked that Gentile people want to meet Jesus. And Jesus tells them in John 10:16, I have other sheep that you don't know about. We need to be careful not to over-interpret this. There are some semi-Christian denominations that over-interpret this. But it at very least means that God has people who have been seeking him among the nations, not just in Israel. That God's got people everywhere. And I just wonder sometimes, based on stories like this, I wonder sometimes how many people are bowing 5 times a day to the east, but in their heart of hearts they're praying to Jesus. I wonder sometimes how many people are going into Buddhist temples, and they're lighting the incense and they're making the offering, trying not to offend the people around them, but in their heart they're worshiping Jesus. And there's a part of us that might say, and we might say this about Naaman, how could Elisha let this go on? Shouldn't Elisha have said, no, you need to make a stand. You need to let people know what you believe. To that I would say, none of us, probably most of us, have not been in a situation like this, where it would cost us everything that we have to worship Jesus. And so, like Elisha, we ought to exercise grace to people in a situation like that, in which they are worshiping God, but perhaps secretly so. We would like to think we would do the right thing, and we'd like to think that we would be willing to sacrifice everything for our faith, but until we're in that situation, we don't really know. And we probably ought to pray for deliverance from that situation, lest we find out. So it just staggers me a bit that there's this amazing moment of grace in the Old Testament, and this man, who I'm sure goes back to his house and tells at least his family what has happened to him, that from that time on, there are Yahweh worshipers in Syria. Syria, by the way, is where the first Christian missionaries were sent out. Antioch, the church in Antioch is in Syria. Some of the oldest Christian churches in the world are in Syria. When Syrian Christians call out to God, they call out Allah, because that's the name of God in Arabic. There's a lot of Arabic Christians around in Palestine, in Egypt, in Syria. You don't hear about them so much on the news, but they're there. God's got people everywhere. God's got people in Saudi Arabia. God's got people in North Korea. God's got people everywhere. And we need to be careful when we start naming off our enemies that we remember that God's got people everywhere. Just something to keep in mind. The sequel of this story is that the servant, who's been the go-to communicator with Naaman, his name is Gehazi. The sequel to this, and we won't read all the verses, but the sequel is that the servant Gehazi gets greedy. And he says, I can't believe that Elisha got offered all this money and he didn't take it. And so Gehazi runs after him and lies and says, 2 other prophets just showed up and we got to feed them. Can we have some of that money you asked for? And Naaman says, sure. And so he hands over the money. He goes on his way back to Syria. Gehazi gets back and Elisha says, where have you been? And Gehazi lies again, and Elisha says, I saw in my heart where you went. I'm a prophet. I know what you've been up to. And Gehazi gets leprosy. Irony. Verse 26, Elisha asks him this, did not my heart go with you when the man turned from his chariot to meet you? Is it a time to receive money and receive clothes and olive groves and vineyards and sheep and oxen and male and female servants? What he's asking for is, who do you think you're working for, man? You are the servant of a prophet. What time do you think it is? We are part of a nation that is about to face the judgment of God in a couple of generations, and you're worried about accumulating wealth for yourself? What are you doing, man? What time do you think it is? Gehazi is one of those people, one of those unfortunate people, that sees the work of God as a cover for personal gain. He still sees Naaman as an outsider. Even after he's been healed, even after he's loaded up the dirt to take back home with him and said he's going to be a worshiper of Yahweh now, Gehazi sees him as an outsider, and because he sees him as an outsider, he sees him as somebody to be taken advantage of. That's what we do to outsiders, right? We get what we can from them. And Gehazi still sees him that way, even though he's supposed to be a person who's serving God. If you go around much in circles where people are not believers, they're not really church-going people, the opinion of pastors among such people is pretty low. Pastors and people who work for the church are viewed in this way. Like people just assume that we're Gehazis, that we are people who are in it for personal gain, and people who take advantage of creating a system where there are insiders and outsiders, and we take advantage of both the insiders and the outsiders. And there are plenty of examples in the modern world. And so please pray for your pastor and your ministers that they not be people that serve the Lord for personal gain. Gehazi's greed is one thing that happens in this story, but the other thing is Naaman's pride. And both of them are united in this, that Naaman's pride and Gehazi's greed put them both in the place where they share a sense of superiority over the other. Naaman felt superior to everybody that he ran into in the story until he got healed. Until he was healed and he realized he was not superior to Yahweh. Yahweh had healed him. And Gehazi feels a sense of superiority to Naaman. Otherwise, he wouldn't have run after him, lied to him, and stolen from him. That sense of superiority puts them in a place where it's hard for them to get in touch with what God is trying to do in their lives. But there are two characters in this story that share the characteristics of God. Elisha, obviously, who is not only willing to help Naaman, but willing to offer grace to Naaman in the midst of a difficult situation in his life. And the anonymous little girl of 2 Kings chapter 5, verses 2 and 3. A slave girl, stolen away from her people, and who sees her master, that she doesn't owe anything to, that she has every right to want vengeance against. And instead she says, I wish that you could be healed by this prophet guy that I know, or that I've heard of. She has something, at the beginning of this story, she has something, in spite of her circumstances, that Naaman and Gehazi and the two kings that show up in this story, that they don't have, which is compassion and humility. She's got it. She hurts for someone who hurts, even though that person is her enemy, technically. She hurts for them. She is humble enough to offer whatever help she can. She's the only person in this story besides Elisha who doesn't have a personal agenda. Even Naaman wanting to get healed, that counts as a personal agenda. She's the only person in the story that doesn't have a personal agenda. In fact, she's willing to let go of a personal vendetta to help and to offer help. Faith and grace are hindered by pride, by the assumption that it's all about us. That's pride. Faith and grace are hindered by the assumption that there's got to be some other way besides humbling ourselves and being obedient. There's got to be some other way that I can receive healing, that I can receive salvation, than by admitting my helplessness. That's embarrassing, to admit that I can't do anything, to admit that I'm helpless in the face of whatever. There's got to be some other way, some other way than taking the path that is laid out before us. And I think, as much as anything else in our modern world, in which it becomes increasingly difficult for people to believe, as much as anything else, it's pride. It's the pride that we are sophisticated 21st century people. And so there must be some other way that we can receive healing and we can receive salvation than by humbling ourselves and admitting our helplessness and taking the path that is laid out before us. There's got to be a more dignified way of salvation than accepting a man who lived 2,000 years ago as Lord of my life. There's got to be a more dignified way than believing these hard-to-believe things, that he died on the cross for my sins and God raised him from the dead. There's got to be something that I can proclaim proudly to people. This is how I was healed. This is how I was saved. In a way that people would say, oh yes, very well done. You went on the quest and you found what you were looking for. We want to be able to say that. I went on the quest and I achieved this. But that is not a way of salvation that is offered to us. That is not a way of salvation at all. There's only one way that's been offered to us, and it's offered by the man who is humble enough to offer himself for our sins. The only way that is offered to us is offered by the man who is humble enough to offer himself, and the way is open to any who are humble enough to offer themselves in return to him. It's humility all the way around that opens up the path to healing and salvation. Faith and grace are hindered by pride. Faith and grace are also hindered by greed and selfishness, the polar opposites of generosity and compassion. Here's the truth, though, and this is what makes it tricky, is that pride and greed and selfishness can take you far in life. Pride and greed and selfishness can gain you fame and fortune and power. That is true. If you really commit to pride and greed and selfishness at the expense of anyone and everything else, it'll take you far in life. But it's also true that it won't get you anywhere with God. Nowhere. Naaman had all that, fame and fortune and power, but he still had leprosy, and he couldn't do anything about it. You can have fame and fortune and power, and you can still have leprosy of the heart, the inability to feel, falling to pieces with a short life expectancy. You can still have that with fame and fortune and power. And in fact, if you read the news about people with fame and fortune and power, it becomes pretty clear that having the good life and having a good life are very different things. Now, here's the risk about preaching about pride. And I know this because I wrote this sermon. So as you're doing something like this and as you're absorbing this kind of information, the temptation is always going to be to think of a particular person and say, they really need to hear this message. Some of you are in that place right now. You're thinking of somebody and you're like, yeah, they need to hear this. That's probably true. But you need to hear it too. And I realized that as I was writing this sermon. I was like, oh, this is a sermon for me. Oh, they're all sermons for me. You guys just get to participate. But this is a sermon for me and you and us. Faith and grace are hindered by pride. Faith and grace are hindered by greed and selfishness. So the question for you, before you start pointing out the logs in other people's eyes or the specks in other people's eyes, the question for you is, what is Christ calling you to lay down today? What is he calling you to lay down in humility? What way has he opened up that you've been too proud to take? What has he commanded you to do that you've said, I am too dignified a person to do that? What way has he opened up? Where has the infection taken root in your life and in your heart? Where does pride and greed and selfishness have a hold of you? The command to us is the same as the command to Naaman. Go down and wash. If you have already been a baptized believer, I would encourage you to recall your baptism, to recall the moment that you went into the water and came out again. And as you went into the water, the pastor said something along the lines of, buried in our transgressions, but raised to walk in newness of life. That old selfishness and greed and pride-driven person is dead. As much as it feels like keep trying to come back, that they're dead. And the new life in which you walk is the life of Christ. Remember that old you, the one driven by pride and greed and selfishness, is dead, and rise up new in the power of the Spirit. Where is God calling you to work on that in your life today? Let's pray. Heavenly Father, we thank you that you are our God who heals. You heal us, God, not only of our physical things, but perhaps much more importantly, God, you heal us of our spiritual sin and our spiritual infection. Heavenly Father, where pride has taken a hold of us, where selfishness and greed have taken a hold of us, God, help us to put that to death in our lives. Remind us, God, of our baptism. Wash us clean. If there are any here today, God, who they know that you have been calling to them, that you have been calling them to a step of humility and obedience to say, I have been running my own life and I want to commit my life to Jesus Christ as my Lord. I believe in what he did on the cross for me. I believe in his resurrection. I ask, God, that you would call them by your Spirit to make that commitment today. To all of us, God, I pray that you would help us make the commitment to lay down our pride, our greed, our selfishness, and become channels of your grace, channels of your generosity, channels of your compassion. We ask it in Jesus' name. Amen.